Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 8.2 for PSY 235 Social Psychology, and we'll be continuing to talk about social influence. Remember that informational social influence occurs in situations where we don't quite understand how we're supposed to behave. So we look to other people for guidance. It's often in situations where we don't understand kind of the rules of how things are done. Like if you've ever traveled to another country and you're kind of unclear on how things are done, you're going to look at the behavior of other people and then try to follow what their guidance shows you. Now, sometimes you can just outright ask for information, but others you just try and, pay attention. How are other people doing the things that they're doing, and follow along. So informational influence, social influence involves people leading us to conform because we see them as a good source of information for our behavior. And there are lots of situations where we find ourselves kind of compelled by this. We conform largely because we believe that other people have more information than we do. So it's like in the last video when I talked about how in tornado season, when I was a graduate student in Nebraska, tornado sirens were a common occurrence. So every time I would hear one in my 5th floor apartment with no elevator in the apartment building, I would poke my head out the door and try and decide, is it a real emergency? And I would look. If there were other people running for the basement, I would go with them. If I didn't see anyone else, I would infer that they know more than I do, and I would go back in my apartment. Now, how has informational social influence been studied historically? And I'm going to start with just sort of clearing out one of the confusing elements of Muzaffar Sharif's classic study of informational social influence by explaining what the autokinetic effect is. And the first thing you need to know is he wasn't studying the autokinetic effect. He was taking advantage of it because it creates a visual illusion. So this video clip is basically a demonstration of the autokinetic effect. You can basically hire companies. If you have a big building and you want to do a display, you see these holiday displays in big cities like New York and Chicago. And basically what they do is use a computer program to program the lights to create the illusion of motion. So what this looks like is a spinning spiral. It's actually just lights behind the windows blinking on and off in a very carefully curated series of motion. But your eyes, the way they function, what you see is lights traveling, moving around the building, instead of simply seeing lights blinking on and off. So this illusion of these objects moving toward one another is an artifact of what's called the autokinetic effect. Now, enough of that. Remember, Sharif was not studying the autokinetic effect. He was using it because it is ambiguous. So he asked his participants a simple question. When they saw this sort of illusion in a darkened room, he asked them, how far is the light moving? Well, the light isn't actually moving. So it's a perfect ambiguous judgment. There is no right answer. And that's what he really wanted to test. So the setup was this. He put his participants alone in a darkened room, and they were asked to estimate how much a light that was 15 feet away from them had moved. And, he used the autokinetic effect as a stimulus. Basically, he had 2 lights blinking in sequence, and in the darkened space, it looks like one light moving back and forth. So he wanted them to estimate how far it was moving. Perfectly ambiguous task. There is no right answer at all. So the light didn't move. It was an illusion of motion. What the participants did, though, since they're asked how far did it move, they believe that it's actually moving. So they would make guesses. because nobody likes a vacuum. They would just make a guess. So usually people would guess somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 inches. But there was significant variability. Some people said 1 inch, some people said 10. On average, it was around 2 to 4. Now, several days later, the participants come back again. But this time they're not alone. They are with others. And they make their judgments several times in the session. And over time, the participants tended to move toward the same range. So they started out with very diverse judgments, but eventually they moved to a consensus position. So what you see in this graph from your textbook, this figure from your textbook, is on this axis you have the estimate of how much movement in inches. And here you have, 3 different participants represented by the different colors, and they're very divergent in terms of their initial judgments over trials. So alone, trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, they're making their judgments out loud in front of each other, but they're not allowed to discuss it. And over time, they move from disparate judgments to coalescing around a kind of consensus judgment. And that's really the essence of this kind of conformity, is moving from independent judgments to, in an ambiguous situation, to coalescing around the same decision, because you are listening to the judgments of others, and those judgments in your own head sound more reasonable than your own. Now, something that arises, in the context of this classic study done by Sharif is the difference between compliance and actually acceptance, or private acceptance. So when we are compelled to conform and we have a genuine belief that what these other people are doing is absolutely right, that's called private acceptance. So you're conforming. You have a genuine belief that what other people are doing or saying is correct. You're going to move yourself in the direction of believing that that behavior is correct. Public compliance, on the other hand, is doing what other people are doing, but inside your own head saying, this is stupid. I know this isn't the right thing to do. What would happen in kind of the Sharif paradigm was that he really really doubted that public compliance was what was going on. So he did follow-up studies where he had the people, after they did the judgments on the light motion, with a group of other people. So they converged on an estimate of how far the light moved. And then he brought them back a third time and had them do it alone. And what happened was that they continued to use the range that the group had coalesced around. So he inferred that that was private acceptance, that they in fact had converged on that estimate and they relied on it, and that became the definition of their reality in that situation. So one study even found that people still conformed to the group estimate went a whole year later. So this is what some scientists call it's a sticky effect, meaning once you put people through this particular manipulation, their behavior sticks. It just continues to be showing that people were relying on each other to define the reality around them, and that led them to privately accept the group's estimate as the real amount. Another study by Nolan is in a more applied context. It's not sort of the rarefied environment of the laboratory, especially with a strange task like the one that Sharif was doing. What Nolan et al. Did was to give a sample that they pulled of California residents some information encouraging them to conserve electricity. And they got one of 4 different messages. 3 of the messages gave them basic reasons to conserve energy, protecting the environment, it's good for culture, it's good for the society, and you can save some money. The 4th message, though, conveyed information that suggested that their neighbors were conserving energy. So what they're trying to include there, here's an ambiguous situation because you really don't know how much energy the people around you are consuming. So this 4th message really kind of suggests your neighbors are doing better than you are at conserving electricity. And what they measured was actual energy usage after those messages were sent home in the mail. This is when people actually got bills in an envelope and it came to their mailbox. So they would open it and they would see these different messages. And then so the dependent variable was how much energy they actually used. What they found was that the 4th message that made it sort of competitive, the one that said, this is what your neighbors are doing, which was completely fictitious, that led to that group conserving more energy than the other 3 groups. So just giving them a moralistic message of saying, benefit to society, protect the environment, or a pragmatic reason like save money wasn't enough. But if you tell them that your neighbors are doing better, it's just like the need to mow your lawn when you live in the suburbs. So here's another example of informational social influence, but it kind of crosses over a little bit into normative, and I can loop back around to this example then. Like, it's spring. There's always this moment in the suburbs when you're trying to decide, is it time to actually mow the lawn for the first time in the spring? And what are you looking to? You're looking around and finding out if anyone's mowed yet. Has anyone mowed yet? Nope, no one's mowed. It's not time to mow. There's no magical date when you're supposed to start mowing. So, since there's no correct answer, you're looking to others who may know more, who may understand the mystery of lawn mowing, and you'll go with what they do. Once somebody cracks that, goes out and mows, and then everybody starts mowing. So it's in part informational. There's no correct answer about the date you're supposed to start mowing. So you're looking to others. It's also a little bit normative. You don't want to be the odd person out in the neighborhood who is just not doing their due diligence and mowing their lawn. Now, part of what's driving informational social influence goes all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about the 2 basic human motives. There's the need to be accepted, so the power of self-esteem, but then there's the idea that we are motivated to feel like we have an accurate understanding of the world around us. And informational social influence relies on the latter, the importance of being accurate. This variable that affects social influence it depends on how you set up the situation, but one of the things is how important is it to be accurate? Now, you could go back to my example about tornadoes, or given that I'm sitting here at my desk during hurricane season, the early part of the hurricane season, but I'm sitting in Ohio. Hurricanes aren't going to have a big walloping effect on me, but I have loads of people I know in Florida, so I often pay attention to hurricane season, and there's always this dance of, do you evacuate or don't you evacuate when you know that there's a storm on the way? There's always some unpredictability, and it is pretty important that you get out if it's a genuine emergency. But there's always this back and forth. Is it really an emergency? Is it not an emergency? Do I need to leave right now? Or maybe the storm will change track. So that's a situation where information is in a vacuum, but it's super important to be accurate. So when an ambiguous task feels very, very important and people are highly motivated, informational social influence increases rather than decreases. So you may find yourself, if you're in a hurricane-prone space, or maybe you're in a place where fire is very likely, and with wildfires, getting out fast is really important. So what can happen though is you're looking to people around you for information. They may have no better information than you do, but you feel like they must have information. And if they feel a little more certain than you do, you'll go with it. So it's well documented that in these sorts of emergency situations like a hurricane or a wildfire, that people will, even if there's a government issued alert, a demand that you evacuate, people are much more strongly influenced by their neighbors than they are by the alerts from weather authorities or from the government. They're far more likely to follow the lead of the people who live close to them. Now, that can lead to some disastrous effects. If the prevailing kind of belief in your neighborhood, and this actually happened in California a few years ago with a big wildfire, there were parts of the region that evacuated immediately, and the places where there was a high degree of compliance with the evacuation order, it really wasn't the order that they were complying with. They were complying with the fact that once one person evac'd on their street, everyone on the street left. And that was a tendency that occurred where you had a positive impact of informational social influence. On the downside, if there were neighborhoods where more people were just sitting tight, that was a situation where people actually lost their lives because they had not evacuated soon enough, and the fire overwhelmed them. So sometimes these situations are very, very high stakes. Sometimes you have really important judgments, like, deciding if you're an eyewitness to a crime and you're trying to identify someone and you're in a group of eyewitnesses. If you're uncertain, you can sometimes inherit the seeming certainty of other people when they make a statement about how tall the perpetrator was or what color their shirt was, and you're in front of that group. You may, even though they're just as likely to be wrong as you are, you may feel like, since they have the appearance of certainty, that they must be right, and then you chime in. And there have been lots of case law. There's lots of case law out there that shows that, eyewitnesses are pretty unreliable, even when they feel absolutely certain. And it's often in these situations when they've had a chance to kind of influence each other, even though they don't think that they're doing so. That's one of the reasons why eyewitnesses, if you have a good crime scene investigation going on, they'll separate the witnesses and not let them talk to each other. So by doing so, they can't influence each other's statements. There are loads of examples from ancient history to the present of when informational conformity can cause really bad outcomes. It's particularly likely during crisis situations, when people are frightened, when people are in a dangerous situation, and they don't have super duper skills for dealing with those crises. They're going to look to other people to try and decide what to do. This is what happens in situations that are referred to as social contagion. So you have a rapid spread of emotions in a particular crowd. Every year there are stories coming out of, I think it's India, but I'll need to fact check that. But there's like specific times of the year when thousands and thousands and thousands of people are moving from one place to another place for a celebration. And sometimes there are these choke points, like bridges, where you have crowds that are tightly packed. And in more than one occasion, a contagion event occurs. In one of the specific ones that was reported many years ago, it was during a time when there had been a spate of terrorist attacks where you had suicide bombers, and someone on the bridge said something and it was misunderstood. It was misheard as the word bomb. And pretty soon, like that old game of telephone, when you whisper a comment into one person's ear and then they repeat it, and eventually it's not the same message, it morphed into the message that spread through the crowd was that there was a bomber and they were about to detonate the bomb on the bridge. So people panicked, and the panic spread through the crowd. Most of the crowd had no idea why they were panicking, but they were in a full-on panic. The only deaths that occurred were from being trampled or crushed as the crowd tried to run away from the bridge in both directions, and they would just trample each other trying to get away. There are thousands of examples of this kind of contagion effect where you have this really strong spread of emotions through a crowd. Another example is something called mass psychogenic illness. Psychogenic is a fancy word for the origin is in your mind. And that's a case where you have a group of people who start to recognize in themselves similar symptoms. They're usually very common types of symptoms like upset stomach, pain in the stomach, headache, a little difficulty breathing. Sometimes they're bizarre symptoms. Like there was a very famous case several years ago where in a particular location, I don't know if it was a town or a county, but there were a group of young people, and they were using social media. So, one of them shared these odd symptoms that they had, and they happened to be tics, like facial tics and vocal tics. And pretty soon it was popping up in this region, in this area. You had several cases, and there were people, epidemiologists were coming in. They were trying to figure out what kind of toxin, what kind of thing was causing this. And then the psychologists were like, hello, I think it's a mass psychogenic illness because the information about these symptoms spread so fast and so hard that people literally thought they were developing symptoms. And then as their intense anxiety and their worries manifest themselves, they started looking more and more like they had these tic symptoms. The conclusion years later is that this was probably a psychogenic effect where you had people seeing each other and then misattributing what they were feeling. A more mundane example of the same thing happens fairly regularly. Like if there's, if you're in a school or in an organization, you can have, a couple of people with a headache, and then you kind of feel like you may have a headache too. And then someone starts a rumor that there's something in the air. And suddenly more and more people get anxious about that. And newsflash, if you get really anxious, your autonomic nervous system can give you an upset stomach and a headache because you're upset, because you're panicking, because you're anxious. So that's a, classic mass psychogenic illness kind of situation where a whole bunch of people can start to experience these symptoms. And not surprisingly, they're usually symptoms tied to the ramping up of the autonomic nervous system to get you ready for fight or flight. So in general, when will people conform to informational social influence? The first rule of informational social influence is ambiguity. You have to have a situation that is difficult to interpret and in which there is no correct answer. The more uncertainty there is, the more you will feel pressured to rely on other people to make decisions. Here's a stupid, everyday kind of situation. You're driving on a major highway, multiple lane freeway, and you start to notice, a lot of people are moving out of the right lane. I wonder why they're doing that. Should I move over? I don't know why they're doing that. I can't see anything up ahead. I don't see any flashing lights, but they're all moving over. I wonder why they're moving over. And you'll just move over. It's an ambiguous situation. You don't know why other people are doing it, but certainly all these people in front of you are doing it, so maybe I should do it too. Because, maybe there's a crash up there, maybe there's a cop up there, maybe there's whatever. But the greater the uncertainty, the more likely you are to conform to what other people are doing. You can also add to that, if the situation is unclear and it might be a crisis, you don't have time to interrogate the situation. You will follow what other people are doing in order to deal with the crisis in front of you. And then finally, if other people seem really, really confident, you may infer that they are experts, that they have better information than you do. And even sometimes people should be an expert, but they don't have any better information than you do. You'll follow them because you think they're an expert and they know what they're doing. So knowing that, how can you resist informational social influence? And your authors give you some very simple guidance, and this has actually been tested empirically. When people are presented with these suggestions, and then they're put into a situation where everything is ambiguous, the being told to ask these questions help them to slow down their thinking and make better decisions going forward. So first, really ask yourself, do these other people know more about what's actually really going on than I do? That's just sort of a reminder to yourself to step back and say, I need to think about this for myself. Other people don't actually know any more than I do. You could look for a legitimate expert. Is there an expert handy? Or with my driving example, I could turn on the GPS through my phone, put my Apple CarPlay on, and I can actually see through the GPS app if other people have reported, say, a block in the road, an accident ahead, the presence of law enforcement. I can actually, find the expert. Okay, it's my phone, but that would actually help me make a better decision about which lane to get into. You can also ask yourself, what these people are doing actually reasonable? With the example of the wildfires in California, I remember distinctly this interview after the Palisades fire where one person they were interviewing was the only survivor from her street. All of her neighbors had died in the fire. And she said, because the reporter asked, why did you leave? Why did you pack up your family and your pets and leave? And she said, I knew that my neighbors weren't leaving, but they just weren't being rational about what was happening. I had, reached out to my brother who is in law enforcement, and he told me, you have to get out now. And I trusted him because he's an actual expert. So ask yourself, is what people are doing right now, does it make sense to do it? And if it doesn't make sense, follow your own logic. You can also finally ask yourself, if I do what they are doing, does it violate my sense of morals, my sense of ethics? Is it common sense? Does it violate my sense of right or wrong? And, that gives you enough time. If the people around you are engaging in really bad behavior, like let's say that there's something going on and, there's, a lot of chaos in the street. Do I want to take advantage of that and steal stuff? Do looting, basically. And if you see them and you ask yourself, wait, before I go along with them and steal that overpriced piece of electronics, does that violate my own moral code? And if you say, yeah, it does, you're significantly more likely to walk away and not engage in the behavior. That concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 8.3. In the next video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 8.3. I just concluded 8.2. In the next video, we'll be covering Learning Objective 8.3, explain how normative social influence motivates people to conform.